to the Vatican. She is smart, whip smart, brilliant, movement builder, mover and shaker, an Auburn Senior Fellow, and my friend. Welcome, Traci.
Well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lashes well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head that's, what's this they call it? Intellect? That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negro rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man ain't had nothing to do with it. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me. And now, old sojourner, ain't got nothing more to say. What does moral courage look like in a black woman facing down racism? When I read the topic for my time with you, my spirit was stirred because it presents a challenge that I have not yet quite been able to overcome. I asked myself, what does it mean for a black woman to face down racism in a racist context filled with toxic patriarchal masculinity? What does it mean to be both black and woman in these yet-to-be United States? Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined a word in 1989 intended to illuminate dynamics that were often overlooked in feminist movements and theory. This was articulated even before that by Bell Hooks, who challenged the notion that gender was the primary factor determining a woman's fate. This exploration sprang from a historical exclusion of Black women from the feminist movement that had been challenged since at least the 1800s by feminists like Anna Julia Cooper. In many ways, the introduction of intersectional theory supported claims made by women of color that disputed the idea common to earlier feminist movements that women were a homogeneous category, essentially sharing the same life experiences. The life experiences of a Black woman in America are not the same as a white woman who is not forced to bear the weight that is often placed on those who wear Black skin. And when these things collide, the weight of the sexism that forms patriarchy and the weight of racism that invades and infects this country, that is a loaded question for you to ask me today. That's why this impromptu address offered by Sojourner Truth came to my mind. Imagine how present these emotions must have been with her for her to be able to articulate them so well in that unplanned moment, and with no guarantee that there would not be serious repercussions because she used her voice. This is what I offer you as an example of moral courage. Moral courage is the determination to take action for moral reasons despite the risk of adverse consequences. Courage is required to take action when one doubts or fears what those consequences might be. Moral courage involves deliberation or careful thought, but oftentimes not a whole lot of time in between. So how do Black women face down racism? I was eavesdropping on the earlier conversation. I could not see the participants, and sometimes it's better that way because you tune in differently on what they're saying. I was listening to them talk about faith communities and what faith communities must do about racism. And I heard one speaker say, I apologize, I don't know who it was I was listening to because I wasn't looking, but the speaker stated a truth that I believe, that none of our sacred texts support racism. It is true that at least in the Christian text, the one I'm most familiar with, the word race is not even in our sacred texts. Our faith traditions do not support racism, yet in many of our faith traditions, or at least in our interpretations of sacred texts, and indeed in our proclamation of our sacred narratives, sexism is supported. I'm going to look at Christian texts because those are the texts that I use, and I challenge you, if you are not Christian or if it's not a faith text that you use, if it's literature you use, that you invite yourself into interrogation with those. I look at the creation story. Two versions of that written in my text. Somebody could not make up their mind. However, what is one to do with a narrative that would suggest that woman was created simply because man needed something to play with? I look at the Hagar text, a text that is clearly a power dynamic between male and female that would denote the presence of rape and not consensual sex, and then after that doesn't work out so well, even the denial of that woman and that woman's child. You may like the story on Moriah where Abraham takes Isaac, but when the text says Isaac is his only born son, it's a lie. I look at the story of Esther, and I already have my plane ticket out here because people get mad when you talk about Esther. Esther, after all, was a hero who saved her people. And this indeed is true, but did Esther have a choice? Having been a young girl whose parents were no longer around and her uncle takes her to a man to join a harem so that she might be chosen? Or how about 2 Samuel 17, where David, the man who's after God's own heart, watches the unfolding of the story of his daughter being raped by his son. And though many of you may say, well, David was not present, the text would indicate that that's true. But what sticks out to me about that text is when David finds out what has happened to his daughter, nowhere in the text does David react or respond to his daughter. Yet when the son who has raped her is later killed, the text says David mourns. And I ask myself, who will cry for Tamar? We are indoctrinated into sacred narratives that objectify women, and we call it holy. Narratives that support current day patriarchy in every current day that we have. The challenge here, in my humble opinion, is that there must be a deconstruction of a theological narrative that advantages some on the backs of others. There must be a deconstruction of a theology of chosenness. A theology that would suggest that God could dare divide God's self against God's self. A theology that would dare suggest that there are some that God would love more than God loves others, since God created all. A theology that in the Christian context has us believing a false narrative that our sacred text, the Bible, is God's book about a holy people instead of a people's book about a holy God. This, my friends, in this Revolutionary Love Conference is of vital importance to me, especially since we are holding it in a place of faith. So I've got to get through all of that as a woman. And then you want me to deal with racism. What demon shall we cast out first? Or perhaps we should borrow a line from Jesus and ask, tell me your name. We are legions. Cast them out all simultaneously. This question that I was asked to share with you today is a real life question for me that comes up over and over again. And quite frankly, you know, I know they're recording, so I might get some pushback for this, but it's how I feel. Queen Mother knows when I say that it's bad news. I'm still stimulated over the narratives that I have seen in the aftermath of the commemoration, not the celebration, of the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. 50 years ago. I am still shaken that as we recount what has happened over these 50 years, the one thing we cannot say has advanced. The one thing we have to put in the negative category as well is that there were no women on the podium 50 years ago, and there were no women on the podium this year either. That's a very telling piece of the story for me. Because as a black woman, I not only have to confront sexism, but I also have to confront racism. And oftentimes, logic would say that my allies are different for those fights. But when I go to fight sexism, my white sisters don't want to see my race. And when I go to fight racism, my black brothers don't want to acknowledge my gender. This came very real for me in Ferguson. May I tell you a story? Ferguson was hard for the faith community. And in my opinion, much of that difficulty was because the Spirit spoke to a woman. Much of that difficulty was that many of the clergy in Ferguson could not figure out why a black woman should be giving directions. To be honest with you, I couldn't figure it out either. I certainly didn't have a large church. I certainly didn't have a large following. There certainly were male-led churches in our area, male-led synagogues in our area, male-led communities of faith in our area that had more impact and probably could have filled the streets just with their membership. But it didn't work out that way. And because it didn't work out that way, there was a lot of overt and covert resistance. Does anybody here know what I'm talking about? I consoled myself in doing the work because I said to myself, these are just the old guys dying out. And the next generation of preachers, the next generation of prophetic voices will have a better understanding, a more equitable understanding of how things should go in this work. But while Ferguson was going on, I also had an early morning prayer call that was open to people in the city. And one of the women, who was not a member of my church but was on the prayer call every morning, she had cancer. She eventually died. And she had left a message that her desire was that I pray at her funeral. So it was a local church, but I had never been there, didn't know anything about the pastor. I showed up because clearly she would have known her pastor. I showed up, and I should have gotten a clue when I got to the door, and the usher, who was a woman, greeted me, and I said, "I'm Rev Traci Blackmon. I am on the program today." And her eyes got as big as saucers. And she said to me, "Wait right here, we need the head usher." It still didn't occur to me. The head usher came, a male, and he did not make a big deal out of it. He escorted me back to the pastor's study, which was filled with men. I was the only woman. That's not unusual for women who pastor churches. I didn't think anything of it as we lined up. I didn't think anything of it that the pastor did not greet me personally, because it wasn't about me. There was a lot going on. And when we got ready to leave the office to meet the family downstairs, I asked him graciously, "May I leave my purse in your study?" And he said, "Absolutely, sure." And we all went down to the family. Now, many of the clergy who were in that room were the young clergy who were out in Ferguson with me. All of them, with the exception of one younger than I, all of them were people that I talked to on the phone often because of what we were doing in Ferguson. But when we got down to the family, this pastor of the church said very loudly to an usher, "Come and get her and show her where she can sit, because she cannot sit in the pulpit with the preachers." He could have certainly told me that in his office, right? Yeah. But he chose to tell me that way. And the usher came to me. And out of the 14, I will never forget the number, out of the 14 ministers who were standing with him, only one said to the pastor, "Where she sits, I sit." It almost made it worse, because I do have a illness-inducing mentality about not letting people see me cry. And his allyship is what was going to take me to tears. The pastor said, "Oh, no, Dr. Scott, I'm not talking about you. You can come in with the preachers." He said, "I understand, but where she sits, I'm going to sit." I think he thought that perhaps that would change his mind. But they escorted both of us to a pew. And so I sat through that entire service and learned something. That all of those ministers who were out in the street with me valued their position in society, valued their access, valued their benefits more than they valued my humanity. And the next night, we were all out in the street together again. And the next night, that could not be a determining factor for the work that we needed to do. And this, my friends, is often the case with Black women. We show up in sexist environments, and we do what we have to do. We show up in racist environments, and we do what we have to do. And we are not afforded the luxury of tears making the waters part in either situation. So what does it mean to face down racism when you're also burdened down by sexism? It means that you continue to show up, you continue to speak up, you find your voice even if others would have it silenced. It means that you don't allow a women's march the day after the election to go on without the voices of Black women who showed up the day of the election. It means that you find ways to celebrate the movement of the incredible teenagers for Parkland and call into question why the cries of your sons and daughters could not be heard in the same way. It means you have to call into question on behalf of your children why it is that guns are an issue when they are in white schools, but they're not an issue when they're in Black streets. I asked myself, why aren't there mass shootings in Black schools? And I've determined I'd be happy to engage this. I have no empirical evidence. I determined it's because our schools are already institutionalized to look like prisons. And so there are no guns in those schools because there are already metal detectors and security guards at every door. So our children are institutionalized in a way that the white kids in affluent areas and even non-affluent areas are not. So our killings happen in the street, but death is death. I ask myself, why did it become a tour all over St. Louis and in other areas between black women, black mothers to be specific, and white mothers, having conversations about what it means to have to give your children the talk? Black mothers saying over and over again that at the age where a child is able to drive, especially our male children, we have to teach them how to behave with police. Conversations that were not happening in the mothers of white children that were gathering in our space. Did anyone see Black Panther? Wakanda forever. There are mixed feelings about the film. I don't bring it up to say whether you like it or whether you don't like it. I don't bring it up for the fanciful land of cinematic brilliance that many of us acclaim it to be. I bring it up because my favorite part of that movie was the recognition that black women didn't need special potions for power. That, for me, is a very real space that has been crafted for the particular illumination of brilliance and boldness and beauty that is the black woman. And the way that we rise again and again is to hold that sacred space for ourselves with one another, to gather, to challenge the myths and the microaggressions that permeate our everyday existence, to hold that sacred space where the intentional shattering of capitalistic and patriarchal lens as standards capable of providing complete revelation of our womanhood are shattered. Time and time again, black women have proven their political prowess, consistently exercising our franchise, becoming the most consistent voting bloc in the nation. I know it's hard to believe, but go look it up. We made the difference in the governor races in New Jersey and Virginia. And of course, in the Alabama U.S. Senate race, helping Doug Jones become the first Democrat elected in over 50 years. Nielsen studies show that black women control $1.3 trillion in the American economy, and we are on track to become $1.5 trillion by 2020. Black women are the biggest and the most consistent users of social media, and we know that we are major cultural influencers because everybody wants to look like us, even if they don't want to be us. Black women are in the pulpit and in the classroom and in the boardroom, and we are making moves in communities and in C-suites and on and on and on. It is true, y'all. Black girls are magic. But now it is time for us to begin to monetize our magic. Now it is time for us to stop accepting people scooting over and allowing us to bring a folding chair to the table. Now it is time for Black women to begin mobilizing and creating our own tables. And you know why that should not be a threat? Because all throughout the history of Black women, especially in this country, we have always welcomed everybody at our table. I talk about the sexism even with Black men, but Black women have always supported Black men. I talk about the racism even with our white sisters, but Black women still showed up with our pink hats on. We, I believe, and I know it's a bold statement, are the example of what revolutionary love looks like. When you think about enslaved women allowing the oppressor's children to suckle at her breast, and then loving that child as though it were her own. When you think about doing that for families that were selling your children off at the same time, and yet we endured. Not only did we endure, but we thrived. When you think about Black women leaving their families to work in the homes of people who did not even recognize they had families, and yet giving the love and the nurturing that was needed in that moment, Black women are revolutionary love. And we can face down racism, even in the midst of sexism, because we have not allowed hatred to consume us. I don't say that to disparage anyone, because even now, the dream of the Black woman collectively is that we would all be one. I don't say it for shame. I say it for truth. I don't say it because I think Black women are perfect. We are not. You cannot live in such toxicity, be bred in such toxicity, and not ingest some poison. But we remain strong, we remain unbroken, and we remain unbowed. That is how we face it. We face it by giving one another some joy, by remembering that even in resurrection, the scars remain, and by reminding ourselves that suffering will not last always, and hatred cannot have the last word. And yet it's hard. And it's a hard that we don't deserve. And it's a hard that if everybody shows up, can be changed. So I'm happy to tell you how we face it, but I'm more interested in us working together to figure out how we fix it. Thank you. Thank you.
Amazing.